On October 23, 2025, the United States national debt crossed $38 trillion for the first time in history. That's $111,000 of debt for every man, woman, and child in America. $287,000 for every household. And it's growing by $23 billion every single day. But here's the part they don't want you to understand. This isn't really debt in any traditional sense. Because when you owe money to yourself, when you can create the money to pay yourself back, when the lender and borrower are the same entity, that's not borrowing. That's something else entirely. That's the greatest financial illusion in human history. And the mechanism behind this illusion is so elegant, so hidden in plain sight, that most people never see it coming. The United States government doesn't actually borrow money the way you borrow money. It creates money, lends it to itself, spins it into existence, and then pretends the transaction was legitimate. It's a magic trick performed with accounting entries, a con game played with numbers, a system so audacious that even the people running it sometimes forget it's not real. But the consequences are real, the inflation is real, and the collapse, when it comes, will be very real indeed. Welcome to the debt illusion, where governments learn to buy themselves with money that doesn't exist, using a system that shouldn't work in a way that can't last forever. And if you think this is just about numbers on a screen, you're missing the point. This is about the systematic transfer of wealth from everyone who holds dollars to everyone who creates them. This is about how the Federal Reserve became the world's most successful counterfeiting operation. And this is about why, when the music stops, the people who trusted the system will be left holding worthless paper. The illusion begins with a simple transaction that happens every week in the United States. The Treasury Department announces it needs to borrow money. Maybe $50 billion this week, maybe $100 billion next week. The amount doesn't matter. What matters is what happens next. The Treasury holds an auction. Banks, pension funds, foreign governments, and individual investors can bid on these bonds. They hand over their real money in exchange for an IOU from the U.S. government promising to pay them back with interest. But there's another buyer at these auctions. A buyer with unlimited funds, a buyer who never runs out of money, a buyer who can purchase as much debt as necessary to ensure the government never fails to find financing. That buyer is the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve doesn't buy government debt with money it saved, or money it borrowed, or money it earned. The Federal Reserve buys government debt with money it creates out of nothing, with a few keystrokes on a computer, with digital entries that appear on balance sheets like magic. Here's how the trick works. The Treasury prints bonds I owe us, promising to pay back the money with interest. The Federal Reserve prints money, digital dollars that didn't exist until that moment. The Fed uses its newly created money to buy the Treasury's IOUs. The Treasury takes that money and spends it on government programs, salaries, contracts, and subsidies. The money flows into the economy, increasing the money supply, inflating prices, and diluting the value of every dollar already in circulation. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve holds the government's IOUs on its balance sheet, pretending this represents a real transaction between independent parties. But it's not a real transaction. It's the government paying itself with money it created for the purpose of paying itself. The Federal Reserve is not independent of the U.S. government. It was created by Congress. Its board is appointed by the President, and its profits are returned to the Treasury. When the Fed buys government debt, the government is essentially writing itself a check, depositing it in its own account, and spending the proceeds. The debt is fictional. The money is fictional. But the economic consequences, the inflation, the asset bubbles, the wealth transfer from savers to debtors, those are completely real. This system has a name, debt monetization. And despite what economics textbooks claim, despite what Federal Reserve officials insist in congressional hearings, despite what financial media reports, this is exactly what has been happening in the United States since 2008. The Federal Reserve has purchased over $8.5 trillion in government securities since the financial crisis. That's $8.5 trillion in money created from nothing to finance government spending. The Fed's balance sheet expanded from $800 billion in 2008 to $6.6 trillion today. Every dollar of that expansion represents money creation, debt monetization, and the systematic debasement of the currency. The scale becomes clear when you look at the numbers. During the COVID pandemic, the money supply increased by 40% in 2 years. The M2 money supply, which includes cash, checking accounts, and easily accessible savings, grew from $15.5 trillion in February 2020 to $21.7 trillion by March 2022. That's $6.2 trillion in new money created in 24 months. And where did that money come from? It came from Federal Reserve purchases of government debt. The government spent trillions on pandemic relief, stimulus checks, business loans, and expanded unemployment benefits. The Treasury financed this spending by issuing bonds. The Federal Reserve bought those bonds with newly created money. The cycle continued until inflation reached 9.1%, the highest level in 40 years. But even when inflation forced the Federal Reserve to pretend it was fighting price increases, the debt monetization never really stopped. On October 29, 2025, the Fed announced it was ending quantitative tightening, the process of reducing its balance sheet by allowing bonds to mature without replacement. Starting December 1, 2025, the Fed will once again begin purchasing Treasury securities to maintain its holdings. The reason given was tightening liquidity conditions. Fed speak for the government needs more financing, and we're the only buyer with unlimited capacity. This isn't monetary policy. This is fiscal financing disguised as monetary policy. And the historical precedents for what happens next are not encouraging. Every government that has systematically monetized its debt has eventually faced the same choice. Stop the money printing and collapse under the weight of legitimate debt service, or continue the money printing until the currency itself becomes worthless. Weimar Germany chose continued money printing. In 1922, the German central bank began purchasing government bonds to finance reparation payments and budget deficits. The process started slowly, with modest purchases justified as temporary measures to support the economy. But once the precedent was established, once the government realized it could finance itself through money creation rather than taxation, the expansion became exponential. By 1923, it took 4.2 trillion marks to buy a single U.S. dollar. The Weimar Republic had successfully eliminated its debt by destroying its currency. Zimbabwe followed the same path 8 decades later. Faced with budget deficits and economic decline, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe began purchasing government bonds in 2000. President Robert Mugabe's government discovered that printing money was easier than collecting taxes, more popular than cutting spending, and more sustainable than borrowing from reluctant foreign creditors. By 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation rate reached 89.76%. The Zimbabwe dollar became worthless. Citizens abandoned the currency entirely, conducting business in U.S. dollars and South African rand. The government had successfully financed itself into irrelevance. The Romang Empire provides perhaps the most instructive historical parallel. Facing constant warfare on multiple frontiers, the emperors of the 3rd century discovered that debasing the currency was simpler than raising taxes or reducing military spending. The silver content of the denarius fell from 95% under Augustus to less than 5% under Gallienus. Citizens could hear the difference when coins hit the table. They could feel the weight disappearing from their hands. What followed was hyperinflation, economic collapse, and the eventual fall of the Western Empire. The United States believes it's different. American officials point to the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, to the depth and liquidity of treasury markets, to the willingness of foreign governments to continue purchasing U.S. debt. They argue that America can sustain debt levels that would destroy other countries because the dollar is special, because treasury bonds are the safest asset in the world, because the full faith and credit of the United States has never been questioned. But reserve currency status is not permanent. The British pound was the world's reserve currency for over a century before being displaced by the dollar. The Spanish real de ocho was the global currency before that. Every empire believes its money is different, its credit is infinite, its currency is eternal. And every empire learns eventually that mathematics doesn't care about military power, that inflation doesn't respect political authority, and that currency debasement follows the same laws, regardless of which government practices it. The warning signs are already visible in 2025. The U.S. government now spends $1.21 trillion annually just to service its debt. 17% of total federal spending goes to interest payments on money the government borrowed from itself. Even at suppressed interest rates, even with the Federal Reserve buying the bonds that no one else wants, even with every advantage that reserve currency status provides, debt service is consuming an increasing share of government resources. Meanwhile, the real economy shows the effects of 17 years of debt monetization. Asset prices have inflated far beyond any connection to underlying productivity. The S&P 500 has gained 115% since the COVID money printing began. Housing prices have increased 45% over the same period. Gold has surged to over $4,000 per ounce. These aren't signs of economic strength, they're signs of currency debasement. When money becomes abundant, prices rise to reflect the abundance. When governments create money without creating corresponding value, the money becomes worth less. The Federal Reserve calls this wealth creation. They point to rising stock portfolios, increasing home values, and growing retirement account balances as evidence that quantitative easing has been successful. But wealth cannot be created by printing money any more than prosperity can be legislated by price controls. What appears to be wealth creation is actually wealth redistribution, from people who hold cash to people who hold assets, from savers to borrowers, from fixed-income retirees to leveraged speculators. The debt illusion works because most people never see the connection between money creation and price increases. They notice that groceries cost more, that housing is less affordable, that their paychecks buy less than they used to. But they attribute these problems to corporate greed, supply chain disruptions, geopolitical tensions, anything except the systematic debasement of the currency that makes everything appear more expensive in dollar terms. The truth is simpler and more frightening. Prices aren't rising, money is falling. The dollar is worth less because there are more dollars chasing the same goods and services. Inflation isn't a mysterious economic force, it's the predictable consequence of money printing. And the debt that appears on government balance sheets isn't real debt. It's accounting fiction, designed to disguise the fact that the government is financing itself through currency debasement. But every illusion eventually collides with reality. Every con game eventually runs out of marks. Every currency debasement eventually destroys trust in the currency being debased. The United States has been able to maintain the debt illusion longer than most countries because the dollar serves as the global reserve currency. But that status is not guaranteed, not permanent, and not immune to mathematical reality. China holds over $800 billion in treasury securities. Japan holds over $1 trillion. These countries are not accumulating dollars because they love American economic policy. They're accumulating dollars because international trade requires dollar settlement. But both countries are actively working to reduce their dollar dependence. China is promoting yuan-denominated trade agreements. Russia has abandoned dollar reserves entirely. Even European allies are discussing alternatives to dollar-based payment systems. When foreign demand for dollars declines, when treasury auctions fail to attract adequate private buyers, when the Federal Reserve becomes the only significant purchaser of government debt, the illusion will become obvious to everyone. The government will be revealed as writing checks to itself, the Federal Reserve will be exposed as a money-printing operation, and the dollar will lose its credibility as a store of value. The debt illusion has allowed the United States government to spend $38 trillion that it doesn't have, financed with money that doesn't exist, backed by promises it cannot keep. But illusions don't last forever. Mathematics doesn't care about political narratives, and inflation doesn't respect government accounting standards. When the illusion ends, when the debt monetization becomes impossible to disguise, when foreign creditors and domestic savers alike refuse to accept newly printed dollars in exchange for real goods and services, the reckoning will be swift and brutal. The debt will not be repaid because it cannot be repaid. The government will not balance its budget because it has forgotten how to balance its budget. And the currency will not maintain its value because it has no connection to underlying value. The debt illusion is the story of how the world's most powerful government learned to pay its bills with money it created for the purpose of paying its bills. It's elegant, it's sustainable for decades, and it's completely unsustainable forever. The United States is not different from Weimar, Germany, Zimbabwe, or Rome. It's just later in the cycle. Subscribe to Money's Hidden History. Because when governments buy themselves with imaginary money, the people who understand the game are the only ones who survive it.